In this video, we're going to talk about how you can brew this 13-degree Tmavé at home, just like me. So what is a Tmavé? Well, Tmavé means dark in Czech. This is a Czech Dark Lager. It starts at 13 degrees Plato and ends up with a full, rich malt character, but still drinkable and balanced. Lots of roasted coffee, chocolate, and caramel notes in this beer, but still relatively refreshing for the darkness of it. So let's dive into the recipe on how you can brew 5 gallons of this at home. Step 1, we need malt. So for this recipe, I won't be showing the computer screen on this video, but you can download the recipe on my website at tanglefootbrewing.com. There will be a PDF in the stories section of the website. Let's start with the grain bill. This may be the most important part of the entire recipe, and I'm going to tell you why it's the most important part of the recipe, when generally speaking the grain bill or the recipe itself is not the differentiator in most beers. This one it is. So I start with Pilsner malt, Bayerman Pilsner malt. This is a baseline 8.2 pounds in a 5-gallon recipe. We're gonna add in 1 pound of Caramunic Type 1. Basically, they are caramelized malts, so they have a lot of that caramelized, toasted-y, sugary character from the grain that you're looking for in richer beers. Finally, and most importantly, we have Carafa Special 2 with 0.9 pounds. So this is the most important ingredient in this entire beer. And I would say this is the most important ingredient, or the single most distinctive ingredient that I use at Tanglefoot Brewing. Carafa Special 2 is a Bayerman product. This is a roasted malt that is roasted to about 400 Lovibond, so it's quite dark. But the special in Carafa Special 2 refers to the grain being dehusked, meaning the outer husk of the grain is not roasted and charred and in the package. And that is often what contributes a lot of that really acrid bitterness from dark beer. So if you ever had a stout or a porter that was real bitter and like burnt chocolate flavor on your tongue, it's usually because it had husks in it. And this might be my favorite malt of all time. Bayerman is an amazing company. I did a whole video on why I use Bayerman malt, specifically this malt. So go check that out on the YouTube page. But I absolutely love this malt. I've won several awards for different dark beers that I've brewed in the past, and I highly credit these malts that I use. Now that we have the grain bill together, let's go ahead and look at the parameters of this recipe. We're going to be brewing 5.2 gallons of wort. We're going to assume an efficiency of 80% because I know you guys can do well. The attenuation is only going to be around 72% because this beer has a lot more residual sugar in it than the other beers that I brew. And we're going to hit a starting gravity of about 13.1 degrees Plato. This beer is going to finish at about 3.8 to 4 degrees Plato, depending on the health of your yeast and how vigorous the fermentation is. And that'll give us about 5% ABV. So this beer is really nice and balanced and is actually one of the best-selling beers at Tanglefoot, even though we're in triple digits still in the summer. People still enjoy it. It's refreshing, but still complex and full of flavor. Now we need to add hops. A special prize goes to anybody that can guess which hops we're using in this recipe.
3, 2, 1!
That's right, it's Czech Saaz. And we're going to assume that this Czech Saaz lot has about 5% alpha acid. We're going to be adding 1 hop addition in this beer purely for bitterness. It's going to be a 60-minute boil addition of 1.5 ounces, which will net us 28 IBUs. Let's talk about the process. Not actually throwing it. So it's your brew day. You're ready to knock out a batch of the 13-degree Tmavé. But where do we start? Step 1, we're going to get our grains weighed out. We're going to mill the grain like every other recipe, and we're going to bring up our strike volume of about 3 gallons of water to around 168 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. We're then going to mash in with our grains to hopefully hit around 153 to 154 degrees Fahrenheit. Once all the grain is mixed in with the hot water, we're going to do a standard mash rest for about 30 minutes. Now, this is my absolute favorite beer to brew. I love working with dark malts. They're very buoyant and they make the mash really nice and fluffy and easy to work with, and they also smell like chocolate cake in the morning when you're brewing. Once that mash rest has completed, we're going to pull off 1/3 of our mash, or as much as you can pull off, into another vessel to perform our modified decoction. On this dark beer, this is also really, really nice. It's very aromatic, very caramely, chocolate, coffee, all those flavors. When it gets boiling, it gets real thick and syrupy, and it's super fun to be around. So we're going to boil that portion of the mash for about 10 to 20 minutes, and we are going to reintroduce it into our mash, which will hopefully bump that temp up to about 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we will begin our recirculation of the wort, better known as vorloffing. So we're going to pull wort from the bottom of the mash tun and recirculate it back onto the top, or if you're fancy like I used to be, you can drain off wort from the bottom of your mash tun and just manually pour it over the top. Pro tip, you can use a little piece of tin foil on top of the mash to help distribute that wort so that it's not tunneling through your mash. Once that recirculation happens for about 20 minutes, we're going to go ahead and take a mash sample of the wort so that we can read the pH as well as the gravity, and then we're going to run off into our kettle, sparging while we're doing that, rinsing all the sugar out of that grain while we're filling up our boil kettle. Once we've collected 6 gallons of wort into our boil kettle, we can begin the boiling process. But first, you want to take a sample of the wort and get a gravity reading on it. Once the boil starts, the first 30 minutes are pretty boring. You're just going to let it go and boil. Once that 30-minute mark is up, we're going to add our first and only addition of Czech size hops. That's the 1.5 ounces to achieve the total IBU of 28 IBUs in this beer. We're going to let that boil for another 45 minutes. Once that 45-minute time period is up, we can add any of our adjuncts that we want, like Whirlfloc, yeast nutrient, or maybe you want to add some more salts because your brewing water isn't appropriately salted. We're going to let that rock for another 15 minutes, and then flame out happens. We turn the burner off, and we're going to go ahead and give this whirlpool motion a go. I'm going to stir that baby around. Get all that trube and coagulated protein material to fall down to the bottom of the boil kettle into a nice tight cone, and we're going to let that sit for another 20 minutes. Once whirlpool's done, all the hop break is settled out, we're going to go ahead and start knocking out our wort into our clean, sanitized fermentation vessel. As we're knocking out, we are oxygenating in line or shaking a carboy after you're done knocking out, whatever you can manage with the equipment that you have. We're knocking out at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and once our fermentation vessel is full of nice dark wort, we're going to pitch an appropriate amount of Y yeast, 2278, Czech Pils yeast, and let it rip. This is where fermentation starts. The yeast is going to start growing. After about 12 to 18 hours, you're going to start to see signs of fermentation, little CO2 bubbles popping out of the airlock. At this point, we're going to take a sample about every 2 to 3 days. This beer is only going to drop about 1 degree Plato per day, so it's going to be a little bit slower. There's no rush in taking samples every single day until the end of the fermentation. After we hit our halfway mark, about 6.5 degrees Plato remaining in the beer, we're going to raise that fermentation temperature up to 60 degrees Fahrenheit from 50 degrees Fahrenheit so that we can have our yeast finish out fermentation strong and effectively clean up any off flavors that it produced during the fermentation. Once we take a sample that's around 4 degrees Plato, we're going to monitor that daily at that point. This beer will finish around 3.8 to 4 degrees Plato, so once you get 2 consecutive days right around those numbers, it's pretty safe to say that the fermentation is complete and we can perform our diacetyl test. Check out the diacetyl video in the YouTube channel. It's called Get Butter Out of Beer. We won't be covering that today, but once you have passed your diacetyl test, you are free to crash the Tmavé. By crash, I mean we're cooling it down from 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We're gonna let that beer chill out for a couple of days. After 2 days or so, we're gonna crash that beer again down to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, where we will allow it to lager for 3 to 5 more weeks. Now you can choose to keep the beer in this vessel and lager it the entire time in the same fermentation vessel. Just make sure you purge the yeast from the bottom of that tank so that you don't have any autolysis. Or you could transfer the beer from that fermentation vessel into a conditioning tank or a keg and allow the lagering process to finish up in there, which is what I do. After your beer is complete, lagered, and bright, all the yeast and everything is settled out, we're gonna carb that baby up to 2.5 volumes of CO2, and we're gonna be able to pour that off of the Lucre side pour faucet into a dimpled mug that's got Tanglefoot's logo on it, and you can cheers to enjoying this beer. And if you do happen to brew this beer at home, make sure you tag me on Facebook, Instagram, start a Twitter account, Google review, tag us in a photo, send me a Polaroid of the picture of the beer that you brewed. Make sure that you document this in your own archive, journal daily about your brewing process. Make sure you come and visit me at the brewery. In all seriousness, if you do happen to brew this, let me know. I'd love to hear how it turns out. I think it's dope that people want to brew these beers, and I'm happy to share any information that I have, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions about it. So that's it. That's how you brew the 13 degree Tmavé. This beer has been one of the most popular beers since I opened Tanglefoot Brewing, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I do, even on a hot day like today. Till next time, keep brewing lagers, and I'll see you there.